Alrighty. Apologies about the delay for content and some stuff that's been coming up. I got out of the hospital about 3 days ago for an emergency appendix removal, so that's where I've been. Um, but I'm expecting to do. I'll do 2 videos tonight. I'll set those up. Sorry. To be there for you. But I'm planning on playing a good amount of the new Pandemonium remix tomorrow morning. So that's at least my plan. But for today, we're going to be getting into Halls of Infusion, where there's a good amount of value for your Spell Reflect here. Um, there's some interesting stuff. There's some stuff that's useful. There's some stuff that's not. But you can get a lot of value out of Spell Reflect in this dungeon for sure. So let's start with our opening area. We're just going to kind of talk about the different mobs. There's nothing really you're going to be able to reflect off of the Geomancers or the Defenders. They just do frontals, they do damage reductions, they do AoEs. You can reflect the apparatus, so this entire first area. The most value you're really going to be able to get out of reflecting is the containment beam apparatus. The only problem with the apparatus reflect that I've noticed, I could be wrong, maybe it's just not showing in my details correctly, is that because I don't think the mob, I don't, I could be wrong here, but I don't think the mobs can channel a movement speed reduction on themselves for whatever reason. But essentially, what you're doing is, while you might not get damage out of reflecting a containment beam, that's just one less beam that's going to hit you. So in this area, it's going to be RNG, whether or not it's cast on you. It's still worth using. But when you do something like if you do this like 3 containment pull here, or when you're getting to these double containment pulls here, it's definitely worth just throwing out the odd spell reflect, trying to get the amount of damage taken down. Just because there's a lot of damage that's going out here, a lot of beams, frontals. You might take a bleed from a defender. So realistically, in this first area, that's all you're really going to be able to use Spell Reflect with. So most of the time, we're basically kicking Demo Shout and then Spell Reflecting the containment beams that we can. For the first boss, the value I like to get out of Spell Reflect is from the Static Surge. That's when the boss puts his hands in the air and does a huge, wide pulsing damage to everybody. The reason why I like to use it on the Static Surge over everything else is the Spark Volleys. The Spark Volleys, if you get hit, that's probably just going to kill you anyway. It does leave a dot on you. You can reduce the amount of damage with Spell Reflect. Excuse me. But realistically, you shouldn't be hit by that at all. So the Static Surge is what I like to do it on. The first tick of Static Surge will go out, but if you can either time your Spell Reflex with the next tick or just wait for the tick after that, essentially you'll be able to guarantee 4 out of 6 of these ticks from the Static Surge, or I guess it'll be, it ticks every 2 seconds, right? So it ticks 0, 0, 2, 4, and 6. So I guess you can always save yourself from 3 of them. 0, 2, 4. Yeah. So if you wait and then use Spell Reflect on the before the second tick hits you, then you'll be able to Spell Reflect the second, third, and fourth tick of this ability. You'll be hit by the first one on cast. But it kind of depends on what you prefer to do. If you want to pre-spell reflect it and spell reflect it on cast, that means you're going to be spell reflecting the same amount of damage or reducing the same amount of damage. And the other reason why I don't use spell reflect when you have the power overload, as an example, is because static surge is going to do way more damage. And because of the change to how power overload works now, where once it drops, it used to drop in its giant field. But now when it drops and spreads. but because we have leap, it should never really be an issue for us, right? So that's why I like to use my spell reflect on the static surge more so than anything else. Coming into here, there's actually some stuff we can spell reflect. These shock troopers cast this lightning blast, um, or can cast this. I think it's the either the lightning blast or the infused lightning. Realistically, it's not something you're going to be able to predict. But if they're at these poles with these shock blasters, they're going to be doing um, they're just going to be doing random additional damage to people. So you might be able to reflect some of that back at them. You can. This is pretty niche, but the swamp toxin, if you get meleeed while you have spell reflect up, it actually reduces reflects a stack off of you, so you don't get a stack from it. It's kind of weird. I don't know why it does that, since it's technically a physical hit. Um, but it can work there. We're not really doing anything with the dragonflies. It's the same thing for these zealots and the stormtroopers down here. Same thing for the frogs. Um, but realistically, you can just kind of send it while you're mid-fight in these poles, and then hopefully you're going to be spell reflecting a little bit back onto these guys. But this is actually where you can have a targeted spell reflect. It doesn't do that much, but the molten crush, or the molten subduction, which creates a subduction zone under a target, rooting them for 4 seconds. So when this guy casts this on you, he targets you, casts subduction, and then puts a big AoE on the ground. What's supposed to happen is the way they've designed it is he casts it on you, puts an AoE on the ground, you get dispelled, you move out of it. But if you're paying attention to the mob and sees casting the subduction on you, you can actually reflect the root, and then you won't need a dispel for the follow-up movement. So that's just a little something you can do. But the first bit of like kind of real value that you're getting from spell reflect, or the value I like at least, is the gulp from this boss. Because the way this gulp works is that it's nature damage, um, and that this nature damage applies swag toxin on hit or when it eats you. Um, what you can do with this, and to reduce the amount of damage your tank is taking, if you if you're basically like the farthest melee out, or if you're just on like farther out of his circle, and your reflect is ready, you can reflect this gulp. So he actually doesn't eat anybody, and then he doesn't. So basically, he doesn't eat anybody, and then you just reflect the gulp. You can stay in and melee the whole time, and it allows your tank to not get the swag toxin stacks. One thing you do need to be careful of is when he's gulping, there's obviously all of the frogs all over the floor running around. So what you actually have to do is you have to, if we're looking at like an MS Paint, right? If this is the circle of the gulp, you have to kind of kite your way around like the edge of it like this, because if you get hit by one of the little froggy boys while you're like waiting for him to gulp on you, you'll end up reflecting one stack of the frog toxin back to the frog. And because you're reflecting it, the ability to reflect is gone, and then you won't actually be reflecting the gulp cast. Um, so this is just a little nice thing that you can do that I like to do. I don't know why it works this way. I think it works this way because it's nature damage that he hits you with. It just saves your tank a little bit, but you have to be pretty careful about it. Mainly because if, like I said, you do route incorrectly and one of the frogs melees you and takes your reflective value out of spell reflect, like you still have the damage reduction, but spell reflect is two parts, the DR and the reflect. If the reflect gets eaten by the little frog, then you can't reflect the gulp. So that's actually something really nice. The other upcoming, you actually get a lot of value from spell reflect just from damage reduction. We're going to talk about all of these mobs here first, and then we'll talk about the bosses. But the main value you're going to be getting is obviously from Deep Chill. This does a ton of damage on application and does damage over time when it hits. So if you can reflect the application of it, it's going to do a bunch of damage, but you'll reduce the damage by 20%, then you'll reduce the following 2 ticks by 2 seconds. Hopefully, you'll have been dispelled or whatever by then, especially with the build I like to play currently, which is this, excuse me, which is this Blade Storm hybrid build. It actually gives us 2 root removals within Blade Storm and Avatar. And on Fortified, just living and not dying to that dot can be really, really dangerous in that hallway. So you can even use something like Blade Storm or Avatar as almost like a secondary defensive. Because if you're playing with, let's say, a lot of people have been like skipping, trying to skip this pack, so maybe you only need it for 2. Well, let's say for 1 pack you only have, like you have a priest and you mass dispel the deep chill. You still want to spell reflect the application because of how much the damage reduction you're putting on it. But for some reason, if you're not running a priest, that allows you to either like avatar this one and then blade storm the next one, but it lets you not deal with the damage. If you do pre-blade storm this deep chill, because the damage requires you to be slowed, you actually don't take the damage at all, so you can use that as a semi-defensive as well. Um, so I would highly recommend using Blade Storm as a defensive, especially on fort weeks. In these packs with the dragons here, the there's the Earthshakers put stuff on the floor. You can't do anything about that. Um, I'll be honest, I haven't been able to test this Thunderstrike correctly. Basically, they removed abilities from these mobs and gave them new ones, and the new ones that they gave them just puts an AoE circle on you. That when it's done, that when it finishes, it just blows up, or when it finishes, it pops and does AoE damage to everything around you. I don't know exactly how it works. I'm not sure if the mob. It says the mobs themselves have a 2.3 second cast on it, so I'm assuming what's possible is if it's casted on you, and then you spell reflect. Once they cast it, it'll spell reflect that damage back to them because it's a targeted spell. Um, but because it says all players within 7 yards of impact, it might just consider you the focal point. Uh, it might just consider you as the ground effect focal point essentially, so you're not actually primarily targeted by a spell. Because the way spell reflect works is if you're going to reflect something, it has to be a spell that is primarily like 1-to-1 targeted. The reason why the gulp works as a spell reflect off this boss is because if there's a bunch of people in the gulp area, like a bunch of frogs or a bunch of players, every single player individually gets contacted 1-to-1 from the Goliath to the gulp to the target, which is why that spell reflect works. So you might be able to reflect this, I'm not sure, but realistically you're going to want to use spell reflect for the deep chills once again just to reduce the amount of damage you take, and you're going to be AoE CCing these mobs so they're not casting on you anyway. But it is the same with these mobs here and this dragon here. The only other thing spell reflect is just good for damage reduction, and this inundate cast hits harder than anything else. This inundate cast is fucking, it is crazy. On high keys, I expect to be on high fort keys. I easily expect to be on one inundate cast. I'm die by the soaring and defensive stancing. On the other inundate cast, I'm spell reflecting because I don't think spell reflect is up every single time. So I think you might spell reflect, die by the sword, spell reflect. Maybe you'll even run something like Fire X Tainted Rage Heart as a potential shield for the next one, especially considering what we can do on the last boss. But that is something that might be happening that you need to be careful of. And reducing every bit of damage you can from this inundate is really, really important because it does a crazy amount of damage compared to everything else in this dungeon. The third boss, however, is probably one of the most rough, wrought bosses. There's a lot of damage types in this game, like or basically like the damage type is either take burst damage or you take rot damage, which is like a damage over time. And this boss just constantly does frost damage, just polar winds, just does damage the whole time. And there's nothing else you're going to realistically be taking damage from in this fight. So this fight is just going to be a battle of attrition with this rot damage. So realistically, whenever it's up, you're sending Spell Reflect. Just have it up. Reduce the amount of damage you take. If you want to time when to use it, like if it's coming up and you want to try and be like a little more crafty with it, sometimes I like to save my use during Glacial Surge, because you are guaranteed, like if you get hit by this, no matter what, you're just dead, right? So because of that, nobody can be hit by it, and that also means your healer can't be hit by it. So if your healer doesn't have a chance to stand and heal because he's moving to deal with the Glacial Surge, that's also when I like to use my Spell Reflect, because that damage reduction just gives that little bit of extra cushion for my healer. Generally, I'll always, whenever Glacial Surge is over, I'll charge back in and Impending Victory, the boss, every single time, because it is just such a dangerous situation with how much rot damage going on, the movement you're required to do, otherwise you just straight up die. It is very dangerous when your healer has no chance to put much of anything into you when they don't have much time to just stand and actually cast anything. So that is something you can try and do if you want to be a little more crafty with it on higher keys. Um, but most of the time, you're just sending Spell Reflect. You're just trying to get as much damage reduction as possible because this boss is just rotting your party away with this cold wind. And it can be very difficult, especially on higher keys. But moving on from that, we go to the real damage value of this area, which is the last boss. And there's a little trick to getting the damage in, because the boss casts two things that you can Spell Reflect. The boss casts Squall Buffet and the cast Focus Deluge. And you can see by the numbers here that Focus Deluge will do more damage than Squall Buffet. Just based on the fun little math we can do. We can just do 3,600. This is just the tooltip damage times 5. That's 180,000 damage versus the 98,000, which is the base base tooltip value here. So you're getting almost double, not fully, like probably 180, 190% value of Spell Reflect by Spell Reflecting the Deluge and not the Squall Buffet. Now that is important, because to reflect the Focus Deluge, you have to have been hit by the Squall Buffet, because the boss guarantee casts the Deluge on the person that gets hit by the Squall Buffet. So what we have to do is we have to send literally everything trying to live the Squall Buffet, with help from our healers, help from our tank, help from everybody. This is why I said we might be running Fire Extain and Rage Heart potentially for stuff like this, where this might allow us to, in phase 1 and in phase 2 of the boss, to actually be able to live that Squall Buffet hit and then reflect the Deluge's damage back into the boss. The other thing to note is after the intermission phase, the boss has stacks of Infuse. These Infuse stacks, what they just increase the damage of the boss, but this also increases the damage of the Squall Buffet and the Focus Deluge. So something that you need to be very, very careful of is if you do not, for some reason, do not have your full toolkit and you're able to live the first Squall Buffet, if you almost die after having everything with the first Squall Buffet, the second Squall Buffet, because of the Infuse buff from the intermission, will kill you. So you have to be careful of that, because it's while the damage reduction can be worth it, it is still not worth dying. I mean, I guess it's possible if you're going to finish the boss off with it, you can just reflect the Squall Buffet itself, because that'll still do a lot of damage back to the boss. But you have to eat that Squall Buffet hit, and then you have to save Spell Reflect for the Deluge cast after the Buffet, or after the Squall Buffet, and that's where most of the damage is coming from on this boss. So that's Halls of Infusion. Um, Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a good one. Bye bye.